Welcome to the Alberta Prosperity Project Podcast. If you're ready to listen, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Thursday, August 4th, 2022. Welcome to episode 13 of the Alberta Prosperity Project Podcast. I'm your host, Hunter, today, joined today with Tanner, who is up in Lloyd with a fresh new haircut. Tanner, how are you?
With a fresh haircut. What is the consensus? I quite like it. I think it's very funky.
I think it makes you look a bit more professional than it was before, so that part's always good.
A little bit more professional.
That's right. I had got my hair cut, obviously, last week. People saw that in the last episode, but it's still looking quite a bit better than yours, I'll still say. But regardless, I mean, that's okay.
You know what? Normally, I would argue vehemently against that point, and rightfully so, I think. But because on Saturday you're getting married, I'll refrain, which, of course, leads me to a congratulations for getting married. That'll be fun.
That.
We're off at the lake to get married. Hey, or you are.
Betcha,
yeah. And the lady is still, she hasn't run away yet.
Not yet. She's still got a few more days, obviously, from when this episode releases. So hopefully by the next episode that I am featured on, I will hopefully be married at that point. That's always the goal. Obviously, I do apologize for the mess. None of that stuff is mine. My house is now being overtaken by plants and by lots of things that I didn't think that a house needed. But I guess as a bachelor, you don't think about that stuff. So
totally. No,
yes.
I'm single. And so, as you know, I'm living the minimalist life. I have two desks here that are shaped in the form of an L. And everything I need is on the desk, believe it or not. I have my books and I have my papers and I have my computer. And it's great because you're quite correct insofar as, keep it low key, keep it casual, nothing too major. I do like some nice decorations and so on, but I expect the house to become quite a bit more full. Hey.
I think so, but that's okay. It should be good. But speaking of which, obviously you guys are coming down today, but on Friday we're having the rehearsal dinner, obviously, and sounds like I might actually get to use the smoker again. Not to get the hopes up of the listeners, not in the Red Deer apartment, but we'll be taking it likely out to camp where we're getting married, and then grab some burgers and put those on the smoker. So I'll at least get to use it at least once more before it goes back to Lloyd. Hey, that's
very exciting. Now that's exciting, and it's going to come back to Lloyd just for a little while though. I think, until you find a more suitable location to engage in smoking activities with special meats, etc., and so on. So we'll try it on Friday. Who's cooking? Is it you or Dad? I guess you'll probably be busy.
Yeah, we'll see. I might get in trouble if I'm not hanging out and helping out, I think. But that's okay. I mean, it's understandable if I'm using the smoker. I think you can't tell a man not to use his smoker, especially when he hasn't been able to. So
it's criminal. I totally agree. It's borderline criminal. Man is never more like a king than when he's by his barbecue. The man at his barbecue is king. He's a ruler, and so you cannot tell him what to do when he's engaged in the art of smoking meats and so on. So it'll be fun. We're excited.
Yes. Yeah, and speaking of rulers and those that try to rule right now, that gives a nice segue, I think, into what we're looking at today, and a bit of a more, I guess you could say, organic episode. We're not going to be as formal with the questions in that, but just going through a few things to start off with. Obviously, if you haven't heard, I'm sure you have, Dr. Deena Hinshaw, who is the Chief Medical Officer of Health here in Alberta. The numbers came out just a few days ago on her bonus that she received from the provincial government, and it was in the sum of over $225,000 for total compensation, almost $600,000 for the year. Any thoughts on that to begin with?
Well, it's a solid bonus. It's a massive bonus. What I would say is this. When, you and I studied history. I loved history. I still do love studying history. I know some people like social more and others like mathematics, but I quite like history. I especially love studying the 20th century. But you can go, the ancients are fun to study too. Who here or who listening or yourself or myself, when have we ever studied history and looked at a government that has presented unto itself generous monetary gifts as compensation for their tireless efforts, quote unquote? When have we ever looked at them and said, no, that's a government that's good. That's an excellent one. Those bureaucrats who give themselves these lavish bonuses, that's a government that we want to be ruled by, or we would have wanted to be ruled by. Where in history is that true? It's never true, right? No, never. Right. It's never true. And it's especially offensive when you appoint yourself such bonuses. And I know it wasn't Dr. Hinshaw giving herself the bonus, but the government as a whole. It's especially offensive to do so when the citizens that you are ruling and that you're presiding over are suffering and are struggling and are trying to make ends meet. So the reason everyone, I think, is so upset by this is that it's entirely unjust. Like all of us were shut down. We were locked down for 2 years, or, you had in a flux, right? But we were in this stage of who knows whether tomorrow will be under restriction. Who knows whether tomorrow I'll be able to go to work. Who knows whether tomorrow I'll be able to enter a restaurant. And then it actually was hammered upon us that, oh, you can't enter a restaurant, or, oh, you can't open up your business for the next 3 weeks, or, oh, you can't do this and that, and you have to live off government in order to pay for groceries and make ends meet, all of these things. While all of this was occurring, now we find out that those who are ruling us and who were actually instituting those measures were being paid handsomely for it. So that's my feelings on the matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You touched a really nice point there. I mean, even a couple articles that I was reading, and I will post some of the links to that as well in the podcast notes. It was mentioning, obviously at that same time, right? It mentioned that thing where it was, we were shutting down businesses and nurses were taking a pay cut. Our finance minister at the time, Mr. Travis Taves, was saying, look, it's we appreciate the work that nurses do and healthcare workers, but we need to cut their salaries. And now all of a sudden, a 63% bonus goes to Dr. Deena Hinshaw. So there's obviously a lot of frustration within that piece, and perhaps people saying there's a bit of hypocrisy.
And you can go like, the bigger issue, no, not the bigger issue, but certainly an issue is that it also conveys incorrect information. So what I mean is this: price signals value. It's like one of the fundamental rules of economics. It's very simple. Price signals value. The higher the price, the more valuable something is. On the whole, some people, for example, you could tell me that this painting is worth $3 million, which means it's very valuable. But if I don't like the painting, then to me, it's not worth $3 million. Great, whatever. But on the whole, the higher the price of something, the more valuable it is. So that's true for wages as well, right? Mm-hmm. What is a wage, if not simply the price for your labor and the price for your time and the price for your skills? That's what a wage is. It's just putting a price on your goods and services, which is your ability to work in some district or with some skill and to do it, to the best of your abilities, etc. And so people are paid different wages, right? You have the minimum wage worker, say at a grocery store, 16-year-old, that's at the till, at the clerk, and is ringing through groceries. Now, he doesn't get paid nearly as much, for example, as the chartered accountant who's been working for 20 years, right? And the reason for that is quite simple, because it's an objective fact that working as a chartered accountant with all of these numbers and this responsibility and this exceedingly intellectual and meticulous task is much more difficult and requires much more training and, years of school versus compared to the grocery store clerk. And so the chartered accountant's work is worth more than the grocery store clerk. The individual's not, right? They're both equal in terms of their worth, for certainly. But society on the whole views the accountant's work as more valuable than the grocery store clerk, right? You can find a whole bunch of 16-year-olds to work at the grocery store. You cannot find a whole bunch of 40-year-olds to go into chartered accounting, right? It's a different market. And the same is true for anything else, right? You look at, for example, someone who works on the oil derricks, right? Okay, so you have to work in minus or plus 40. You have to work with backbreaking work. You have to work in dangerous conditions. Like rigging is exceedingly dangerous, right? Massive chains and everything's spinning and moving, and there's drill hands, and there's, all of these guys trying to work in unison. And there's mud everywhere, right? And it's filthy, and et cetera, et cetera. And you just, you're away from your family for a long time. You're working up at camp, and you're in the middle of nowhere, and so on and so on. And so that job compared to, say, I don't know, what's an example of another job that you could give? The gas station attendant, right, is different. The gas station attendant can go home to his family every night. He doesn't have to work outside. He can work inside and therefore be shielded from the elements and not have to suffer through, minus 40 or plus 40. Or if he does, it's only for a little while. Or if she does, it's only for a little while. And he's not isolated. He's not working in deadly conditions or dangerous conditions that can, snap and break something in an instant, et cetera, et cetera. And so you have to pay the rig worker more than the gas station attendant, right? You have to do so, because if you don't, no one's going to work on the rigs, right? Who's going to go up into the middle of nowhere to drill for oil in the middle of winter, away from their families and their friends for weeks at a time, if they're only getting paid $10 an hour? Yeah. Nobody's going to do that, right?
No, for sure.
So the value of their work is higher in comparison. Again, don't become confused and say that, well, the individual is worth more. No, that's not true. But the work is different and the market is different. I had a university professor. I can't remember what the class was, but one class, she was discussing how furious she was. And she was furious that the guys working on the rigs get paid more than her. She says, why do these guys need to be getting paid whatever she said, 200 grand or something, whatever it was, every year. She's like, it's ridiculous. It's a joke. And I was this close, and I wish I had, but I didn't because I was sitting at the very back. I wish I'd piped up and I would have said, would you like to go out when it's minus 40 and sling chains? Like, would you like to be involved in that sort of action so that we can keep the power on in this university to where we can be indoctrinated with these socialist views?
Yeah.
That would have been a solid response. And if I was quicker, if I was wittier, I would have done it. But I didn't. It's one of those things like George Costanza, where you go home afterwards and say, darn it, I should have said that, and he goes, with the shrimp. That's a funny episode.
Yeah.
Anyways, so that's what I would have done, but I didn't. But it's true, right? The market is different. If you're a university professor, you're inside, it's warm. You're teaching students. It's a cushy job. I mean, insofar as you have to work for sure and present papers, but you don't have to suffer through the elements in a deadly, dangerous environment that can be, that's isolated and lonely and so on, and, away from your family. So markets are different. Now, you bring that back to what's happening with Hinshaw, insofar as if price is a signal of value, and if wage is the value, if wage is the price of your labor, then what is being communicated to Dr. Hinshaw is that her labor is exceedingly valuable, or that, more rather, what she did over the last 2 years, or what she's doing now, is right and is valuable and is, the right thing to do. That's what's being communicated to her. Now, the reason that we're so upset, right, as individuals in Alberta, and most Albertans are, at least from what I can tell by the comments, we're just speaking objectively here, right? This isn't even partisan. You just look at the global news comments or the mainstream media comments on there, and people are not happy with this. People are upset because, well, first, they weren't earning that bonus, even though, because they were suffering under these lockdowns, and two, because we're not certain. Well, I have my own opinions, right? That what happened was the right thing. It wasn't the right thing, right? That's our contention, is that this wasn't the right thing to do, right? Again, and it's actually, I think, disingenuous to blame Dr. Hinshaw. She's just acting as a rational individual here. She didn't give herself the bonus, right? It was handed to her. So that actually is, I wouldn't be yelling and screaming at her, insofar as, maybe she could have refused it, I guess. I don't know. But for me, that's not the issue. Is that, you have a select group of powerful oligarchs in this bureaucracy who just give themselves, bonuses and write out checks to those who are at the very top. Meanwhile, you're cutting wages and not allowing people to work at the bottom, right? Because you got to close down and lock down. And so it conveys this false information, so to say, right? That's how I would put it. That's the issue. That's the issue.
Absolutely. And that, when you were mentioning those examples of the difference between the workers, for those that don't know, I obviously don't think I mentioned on the podcast, I do have a large passion for aviation. And so, a pilot is going to be paid very, very differently than a flight attendant. While they're both equally important, and I sure would not want to be a flight attendant, I'd happily be a pilot. The pilot usually is making much more. And, the training costs are so much higher. The risk is so much higher. The responsibility is so much higher. But speaking of planes, I'm sure that another thing that people have heard in the news is that our Prime Minister, Mr. Justin Trudeau, has recently been on a lot of trips in the month of July. I'll just give a quick stat and then maybe get your opinion on this as well. But I mean, obviously, greenhouse gases and climate change are a forefront for this government that we have right now. And the average Canadian, you and myself and our listeners, will emit about 4 tons per year. That's just, with driving, with heating our homes, everything that we do. But the jet fuel used by Mr. Trudeau this last month was 85.8 tons. So about 20 times what I will use, in a year, or it'll take me about 20 years to make up what he did in 1 month of flying alone. So any thoughts on that from the Prime Minister, or that's just whatever, we'll sweep it under the rug?
No, it's hypocritical. Again, APP, so we're nonpartisan, right? We always say it, we're nonprofit, right? Yes. We're not, we don't endorse any specific political party, but Absolutely. we have a obligation to discuss what's real and what's true. So what's real is that Mr. Trudeau and his government consistently say that oil is dirty, oil is bad, we're sick, we can't use fossil fuels, we have to go green, et cetera, et cetera. But then he turns around and does this. So whether an individual votes liberal or conservative or PPC or, Maverick, doesn't matter. The reality is plain. It's true. It's clear that Trudeau is acting hypocritically, right? He's being a hypocrite. You say one thing and you do the exact opposite, right? Rules for thee, but not for me, right? There's no one righteous, but one, right? This is what we continue to see again and again and again. Like the theme of this podcast really is this this government corruption, right? Where all of these rulers that are granted this power tell us one thing and they force upon us laws and restrictions for the citizenry, but they do something completely the opposite. So, okay, so we're supposed to lock down. We're supposed to not work, right? We're not allowed to go into the office. We're not allowed to make a living for ourselves. We have to live off government, as I mentioned, to get groceries. So we can't earn a wage, or at least a wage that we think or we know is sufficient or need to be sufficient, even in order to combat inflation. We can't do that. But meanwhile, the government officials, these powerful oligarchs, these bureaucrats, are able to receive these generous bonuses, right? Massive bonuses, along with their already substantial and healthy, very healthy wage, like maybe exceedingly healthy, right? So they're already not poor, but you add a bonus on top of it, right? It smacks of insult. And again, I'm not knocking the wage itself, right? Individuals should be able to earn money. That's a different conversation. Whether one thinks it's too high or not, that's not for the purpose of this podcast. But just the fact that while we weren't allowed to work because they said so, the government said so, they were giving themselves massive checks, massive bonuses. The same is true with Mr. Trudeau. We're not able, well, I mean, we can use oil and gas, of course, but it's being restricted. It's going to be restricted, right? We have these certain rules and regulations that are heavy set on the oil and gas sector, forcing our industry to leave, and they are leaving, and in droves, right? And that's just clear and present. You have all of these rules and restrictions in order to curb our usage of gas and oil and diesel and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the prime minister and presumably others can do what they want, and they can fly wherever they want, and they can use all of these, again, quote unquote, fossil fuels and emit all of this greenhouse gas that they're so passionately combating. But for them, it's okay, right? If we do it, it's not. And again, you can't confuse it. And we're not saying that taking a vacation is bad. We're not saying that flying is bad, right? None of those things. If an individual wants to do so, let him. If Mr. Trudeau wants to do so, let him. But don't tolerate this rhetoric where he says one thing and then does the complete opposite, right? It's a totally different scenario. If he wants to fly in a private jet, then he should say, I'm grateful for oil and gas because I'm able to take a vacation to wherever he's off to at this point in time using that oil and gas. And so that seems to be what the topic of the podcast has become, is this idea that government is becoming increasingly corrupt. And I mean, it's always been corrupt, right? I mean, nothing changes under the sun, says the teacher in Ecclesiastes. Fair enough. But it's becoming worse and worse and worse. And it's they're not even hiding it anymore. Right? They're just putting it out in the open, right? For all of us to see. And they just flaunt it like it's no big deal. So that's why I think the citizenry and the individuals here, quite rightly, are so displeased with what's going on.
Absolutely. And I mean, I know that recently you've talked a couple times on fertilizer and the bans that are coming in use with that, and all these climate change protocols that are being brought in. We've talked about climate change previously on the podcast and the ethics and morals of whether that's actually right or wrong. So we won't have to touch as much on that this episode, but more so I'm wondering, when this is happening where it's say one thing, do the other, how do we actually stop this? What would be the solution in the APP's eyes?
Right. Well, firstly, I mean, obviously we're advocating for independence. So if you can decentralize government, it makes it that much easier to monitor, right? Sure. What we have right now is a system where you have one powerful group, right, at the very top, and they control a lot. And then you have another group, like the provincial governments, that also control a lot. Okay. And then you have the municipalities. But just due to the size, right, the sheer size of the country and of the government's controlling it, it's almost impossible to accurately scrutinize them and to watch them carefully and closely, right? The more decentralized you can make government, the more you can bring it close to home, so to say, as in the more that the communities themselves can monitor the government, the more efficient and the more careful government has to be. So if you could, just for example, this is just an example. This isn't exactly what's in our policies, right? This is just an example. If you could make government, if you could allocate more power to individual governments that serve just specific communities, right, that government would be more efficient. So, for example, if I could give, here in Lloydminster, the most immediate government, not that you want to give them more power, but if you could take the power from the provincial government and allocate it to the municipal governments, then the individuals in that community would be able to more closely monitor what that municipality is doing. So, if you could, for example, allocate to the municipalities, say Lloydminster, the powers of, I don't know, let's just say taxation. You probably wouldn't do that, but just suppose that you did. Then all the individuals in Lloydminster would look much more carefully, very carefully, at what the mayor and his council is doing and what they're setting the tax rates at. And if their tax rate was, say, 25%, but over in, for, I don't know, Manville, which is what, 40 some minutes away, their taxes are 10%. Well, maybe it would be an incentive for some individuals to move from Lloydminster to Manville and drive into work or change occupations, et cetera. And then you'd reach an equilibrium. And so you'd be able to more closely scrutinize what the government is doing. Now, whether that's possible or not, I don't know. But on the whole, the idea of decentralizing government to give smaller communities more control over what their most immediate government is doing is something the APP is proposing, right? And so it all it does is it just allows you and I, as individuals, to more carefully watch what government is doing and therefore snuff out the corruption, right? If there is corruption, it can be dealt with in a much more immediate and efficient manner, I would say, right? So that in itself, I think, makes sense. I think we've mentioned also before recall legislation, right? Yeah. Have we on the podcast?
That we have, yes.
You know, just quickly, the listener can read it in our proposed policies and governance, but at what we have in present in Alberta with regards to recall, which is removing an elected politician basically before their next election, but you do it legally. It's recall, but it's not recall what we have right now, right? The boundaries and the barriers that are erected in order to actually initiate the recall are impossible to climb or to scale. It'll never happen, right? That recall legislation, quite clearly, I think, was simply instituted to appease the people of Alberta who were upset with the way that certain MLAs were running their constituencies. Okay, fair enough, right? So instead, what we're proposing is still recall, but you just make it easier to initiate the recall so that if you have a politician who has abdicated his or her responsibility then to his or her constituents, then you can remove them from office before the next election. Now, there's a balance to strike, right? Because you don't want it to be so easy that the opposition, who doesn't have your constituency's interests in heart, is able to mobilize a group and actually oust that politician, right? The MLA who's actually good, for example. But you also can't have it that it's so difficult that no MLA will ever be ousted if it's needed to be, right? So we're trying to study and strike that balance in order to reach an equilibrium where it's not too difficult, but it's also not too easy. And so we're welcoming any input on what people believe the right numbers on that would be and so on. So, you know, even that, you have two. I would really say, though, no, I would say the decentralization itself is so critical. The fact of the matter is there are always going to be individuals in government who are corrupt. That's just the nature of the world we live in. And so the question is not so much how can you destroy the corruption in man, right? That's a religious discussion. It's more how can you restrain the corruption that currently exists? How can you do that? And so these are the things that we're proposing. You know, even if, and this isn't in the policies yet. Yeah, maybe it will be. But what if we did this? What if for every percentage of inflation for every time inflation increased 1% in the country, what if you had a law that said that the MPs or MLAs, whatever you have to reduce their salary by 10%? Like you have to, right?
They'll try to get negative, and they'll try to get de-inflation, negative.
Oh yeah, inflation. Totally. You'd have to put a clause in there. It only goes to zero, but nonetheless. Okay, so what if you did that, right? You would see inflation drop so fast, right? You'd see them, maybe taking bribes, but they already take bribes now, right? It's just just the way it is, and so you have to cut that out as well. But what if you did that? Oh, it certainly would look different, right? It would certainly look different. Or you could do the same thing with the housing market. If you inflate the housing market by introducing, all of this, what would you call it? Banking magic, so to say, where you have money created out of thin air and people are able to finance and refinance and triple refinance their homes to introduce more, equity injection and all of these words that sound large, but are really just playing magic tricks, right? Maybe you could entice a politician through other measures to stop that sort of thing, right? With benefits and what's the word? What's the proper word I'm thinking of? With you give them reason to act appropriately, right? You give them incentive to act justly and not unjustly. So, And the way that you monitor that is by decentralizing as much as possible. So that's a huge reason why we're proposing independence, right? Our objectives are different than the objectives of Ottawa in Alberta, right? So if you can decentralize, if you can make the government smaller, much smaller, and keep it centralized to Alberta, well, then Alberta will be able to determine for itself what it wants much more easily. It can give mandates to its government to do this and that in a way that they cannot presently do so now, because we're also ruled by a federal government in the East. So that's our thesis. So I would say our intent is to decentralize government, make it smaller, so that we as individuals, right, as a community, are able to more closely scrutinize them and what they're doing. And when corruption arises, as it most probably inevitably will, according to history, we're able to snuff out that corruption as quickly as possible and keep the machine running as efficiently as possible, is how I would say it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And if you want to help stop that corruption, or at least put those barriers on it, like we mentioned before, I encourage you to check out our website and consider becoming a member. That is what helps keep the podcast going, keep the project going, and help us gauge our support all across this province. And so if you want to do that, you can head to our website. That's Alberta Prosperity Project.com. It's also there that you'll see our proposed policies and governance documents. Like Tanner was mentioning before, you can see everything that we're actually putting forward. And you can also give your advice on that. You can reach out to contact@albertaprosperity.com. And that's how we're going to hear your feedback and how we can learn from that as well. So with that said, if Tanner can figure out how to use Zoom by himself next week and learn how to record by himself, maybe there will be a podcast coming out. We'll see. Maybe. No promises on that. But if not, if we don't see a podcast next week, we'll for sure be back in a couple weeks, hopefully with a ring still on my finger. That is what we are crossing our fingers for. So with that, thank you so much for talking to me, Tanner, and look forward to seeing you soon.
You bet. Have fun at the wedding.
Bye.